What if we told you that Hollywood had a brief golden era where absolutely nothing was taboo, before rigid censorship tightened its iron grip and moral authorities seized creative control? The film industry operated as a genuine creative wildfire, where controversy sparked box office thunder. From depictions of female ambition to unflinching examinations of race relations, these movies represented a vision of cinema that the establishment deemed genuinely dangerous. Let's begin. Number 13. Shopworn. 1932. Before the production code became Hollywood's moral police, Clara Bow ruled the roost as cinema's most daring actress, and Shopworn proved exactly why she terrified the establishment. Released in 1932, this melodrama follows Jane, a working-class woman desperately climbing the social ladder through whatever means necessary. The film didn't shy away from depicting her climbing into wealthy circles through romantic entanglements and manipulation tactics that would make modern audiences nod knowingly. Jane navigates nightclub culture, seduces wealthy patrons, and positions herself as indispensable to men of influence without ever displaying shame or remorse for her strategic choices. What made censors absolutely lose their minds was Bow's refusal to suffer consequences for her ambition. She wasn't punished. She wasn't shamed into submission. She simply moved on to her next conquest with a wink and a cigarette, treating morality as a luxury poor people couldn't afford. The character doesn't apologize for her survival instincts. She explains them. She justifies them. Though she celebrates them. This philosophical stance represented everything the emerging moral code would criminalize about uncensored cinema. The film presents economic desperation, not as something requiring moral punishment, but as a reality requiring practical solutions. Contemporary morality boards found this philosophy absolutely poisonous. A woman accepting her own ambition without divine retribution flew directly in the face of everything the Hays Code would later demand from female characters. Reviewers called it a flagrant celebration of immorality. Religious groups demanded immediate bans across every state. Several territories attempted to prohibit exhibition entirely. Catholic dioceses organized boycotts specifically targeting the picture. Yet audiences flocked to see Clara Bow operate on her own terms, making the film one of the highest-grossing releases of that year, despite fierce opposition from every moral authority imaginable. The picture earned over $2 million at the box office, astronomical for 1932, proving that the viewing public wanted stories the censors wanted buried. Box office success directly challenged the authority of moral watchdogs, which only intensified their determination to implement stricter controls. Bow's career would suffer tremendously after the code's implementation, with studios placing increasing restrictions on her character choices. Shopworn remains a fascinating artifact of a brief moment when ambition and irreverence weren't automatically punished on screen. Number 12. An American Tragedy. 1931. Director Josef von Sternberg adapted Theodore Dreiser's controversial novel into a harrowing examination of class struggle and desperation in 1931. The film follows George, a working-class man who murders his pregnant girlfriend to escape poverty and pursue a wealthy socialite instead. This isn't a crime of passion or temporary madness. It's calculated, premeditated murder born from economic desperation and ruthless social climbing ambition. George's moral calculus is terrifyingly logical within the film's framework. He loves her in some way, but he loves wealthy advancement more. The film asks whether we understand his motivation, and understanding feels like complicity. Cold, calculating, brutally honest about human nature and the corruption that poverty breeds. The narrative presents his crime as understandable, without being condonable. A philosophical stance that absolutely horrified moral authorities. What horrified the establishment wasn't the murder itself, but the film's refusal to moralize in traditional terms. The camera doesn't condemn George with editorial judgment. It simply observes his logic with clinical detachment. Here was a protagonist driven by economic desperation, rather than pure evil or demonic corruption. His motivations are explicable. His reasoning is comprehensible. That comprehension seemed more dangerous than any amount of theatrical villainy. Audiences could understand George's motivations, even if they couldn't condone his actions morally. This moral ambiguity became kryptonite to the production code enforcers who wanted clear heroes and villains, and not complicated men driven by circumstance into darkness. The film's examination of class resentment and economic inequality struck the establishment as dangerously radical. What if poor audiences watch this and recognize their own circumstances? What if George's logic seemed appealing to viewers struggling through depression poverty? Southern states attempted total bans. Eastern Pennsylvania's censorship board demanded severe cuts, removing the most sympathetic portrayal of his motivations. The film's ending, where George faces execution, was deemed insufficient punishment by moral watchdogs who believed the narrative sympathized too much with the criminal mind. Some demanded alteration to show explicit divine judgment. Sternberg refused major revisions, resulting in the film being quietly shelved by Paramount in certain territories. Viewers who saw it described being shaken by its willingness to explore the desperation that breeds violence and moral compromise. Number 11. Flesh. 1932. While most people remember Marlon Brando's later method-acting revolution, few realize how controversial John Ford's 1932 film Flesh truly was in its historical moment. The picture follows Joe, a Swedish immigrant factory worker whose wife cheats on him while he serves in World War I. When he returns home broken and traumatized by combat experience, he discovers her betrayal and spirals into despair that threatens to consume him entirely. The narrative doesn't present his pain as redemptive suffering, but as genuine psychological damage that marital infidelity inflicts on vulnerable men struggling with war trauma. The film's graphic depiction of marital infidelity and its unflinching portrayal of working-class struggle struck mainstream audiences as genuinely dangerous cinema. Ford refused to soften the wife's characterization through dramatic convenience or moral instruction. She wasn't a corrupted woman who needed redemption or conversion back to marital obedience. She was a person who made her own choices and lived with consequences that extended beyond moral punishment or divine retribution. Her affair wasn't presented as titillating scandal fodder for morality lectures, but as the tragic result of loneliness and circumstance, making her sympathetic even in her transgression. Morality boards erupted in fury across the country. Reviewers called it an assault on family values itself, striking at the idealized foundation of American society. Religious organizations ran targeted smear campaigns in newspapers, warning families away from what they called a celebration of marital infidelity and domestic instability. The film's refusal to present marriage as sacred and unbreakable regardless of circumstances seemed theologically dangerous. Several Midwest territories relegated the film to late-night screenings only, effectively pushing it into the shadows of exhibition schedules where moral authorities couldn't monitor attendance. The picture's honest treatment of working-class hardship and domestic breakdown made it simultaneously too real and too dangerous for mainstream audiences already wrestling with Depression-era anxiety and economic collapse. Ford's later reputation as a masterful storyteller helped rehabilitate the film in retrospect. But during its initial release, The Flesh represented everything the emerging moral authorities feared about uncensored cinema depicting ordinary suffering. Number 10. Midnight Mary. 1933. This 1933 Warner Brothers feature scandalized audiences by daring to suggest that a woman involved in organized crime might actually be sympathetic and comprehensible, rather than morally bankrupt and deserving destruction. Midnight Mary follows a nightclub entertainer and criminally connected woman whose romantic choices land her in prison. Rather than serving as cautionary tale about the inevitable punishment for moral transgression, the narrative frames her as a victim of circumstance and abandonment by the man she trusted most. Joan Crawford delivered a powerhouse performance that portrayed feminine agency within criminal underworld without constant condemnation and judgment. She navigates the dangerous world of speakeasies and mob connections with intelligence and tactical awareness. The production code enforcers couldn't abide by a female protagonist operating within immoral systems without constant self-flagellation and remorse. Where were the scenes of her begging forgiveness? Where was the moral clarification that she'd learned her lesson about female ambition? The film simply didn't provide what moral authorities demanded. MGM faced tremendous pressure to add an ending where Midnight Mary essentially renounces her existence and accepts prison as divine punishment for her transgressions. The studio reluctantly complied by tacking on new scenes suggesting redemption through suffering. However, audiences who saw early preview screenings before the moral revisions knew the original cut featured a far more ambiguous and morally complex ending. Rumor persists that alternate footage exists showing Midnight Mary accepting her fate without the pearl-clutching regret the revised version demands. The picture was banned in Ohio, severely cut in Pennsylvania, and faced prohibition from exhibition in Catholic dioceses across the country. Crawford's willingness to play morally compromised women with intelligence rather than titillation marked her as dangerously controversial during this pivotal moment in Hollywood history. Number 9. Scarlet Dawn, 1932. Scarlet Dawn shocked audiences by depicting Russian immigrants and revolutionaries with nuance and historical context during an era of intense anti-communist hysteria. The film traces a Russian prince who escapes execution during the revolution only to find himself working as a taxi driver in Constantinople, stripped of wealth and status, and forced to confront his own irrelevance. His former servant, now a revolutionary officer, represents the new order he fled. They encounter each other across the ideological divide, and the film allows viewers to understand both perspectives without presenting either as inherently evil. What absolutely terrified the American power structure wasn't the revolution's depiction, but its sympathetic portrayal of the communist cause and its grievances. See, the film allowed viewers to understand the rage that sparked upheaval without reducing it to simple evil corruption of good society. This balanced perspective seemed almost treasonous to government officials and conservative watchdogs during an era when Soviet communism represented the existential threat to American capitalism. The film didn't glorify communism, but it explained it, and explanation itself seemed dangerously radical. Senators demanded the film be withdrawn from circulation immediately. Industrial titans allegedly pressured Warner Brothers to suppress distribution. The picture was banned across much of the South, where anti-communist sentiment ran deepest. Even in northern territories, exhibition was restricted to adult-only screenings in select venues. Insurance companies raised rates for theaters showing it. Effectively pricing smaller venues out of exhibition possibilities. The financial pressure to withdraw created a self-fulfilling prophecy of suppression. Director Richard Florey's willingness to depict historical revolution with moral complexity rather than propagandistic condemnation made him a target for future blacklisting pressure. Scarlet Dawn remains a fascinating window into Hollywood's Cold War anxieties. Though most modern audiences have never encountered it, having been effectively buried by the very forces that deemed it threatening to national security and social stability. Number 8. Foolish Wives, 1922. Erich von Stroheim's 1922 masterpiece, though predating the pre-code era by a decade, established the template for everything the production code would later criminalize about cinema. This audacious film depicts a charming con artist seducing a wealthy American ambassador's wife through sheer force of charisma and manipulation. Von Stroheim's protagonist doesn't moralize. He simply pursues his goal with calculated precision, and the film allows viewers inside his consciousness without editorial judgment about his predatory behavior. The initial cut ran 4 hours, depicting extended sequences of seduction, infidelity, and moral compromise with such unflinching detail that even 1920s audiences recoiled in genuine discomfort. Censorship boards demanded extensive cuts. The film was reduced nearly in half before achieving wide release. What remained was still potent enough to inspire outrage from religious groups and conservative societies that correctly recognized Foolish Wives as a fundamental threat to their moral authority over cinema. The film presented seduction as an intellectual and emotional game rather than moral catastrophe. Von Stroheim's vision of filmmaking that permitted moral ambiguity and audience complicity in questionable behavior became the blueprint for everything the production code would criminalize regarding artistic freedom and moral complexity. Though technically released before the official pre-code era, Foolish Wives represents the aesthetic and moral approach that the 1930s briefly permitted before institutional control reasserted itself violently. The film became a cautionary tale about what censorship-feared cinema could accomplish. The film's narrative approach influenced generations of noir directors who learned how to suggest moral complexity despite censorship restrictions, proving that suppression merely forces artists underground rather than eliminating their voice. Number 7. 3 on a Match. 1932. This 1932 Warner Brothers picture dared to suggest that a woman choosing career over motherhood might not automatically face divine retribution and complete destruction. Anne, played by Joan Blondell, abandons her child to pursue a glamorous nightclub career, prioritizing her own fulfillment over traditional maternal duties. The film unflinchingly depicts her choice as understandable rather than condemnable, treating her as human rather than monster. What scandalized audiences wasn't merely the plot, but the film's refusal to punish her severely for her decision in the traditional morality play format. Yes, tragedy eventually befalls her child through her own negligence, but the narrative framework doesn't present this as inevitable cosmic punishment for female ambition. Instead, it suggests tragedy emerges from circumstance and human imperfection rather than divine judgment on her choices. The film presents consequence without moral righteousness. Morality boards absolutely detonated with fury. How could Hollywood suggest that a mother prioritizing her own happiness was anything other than monstrous and deserving universal condemnation? Multiple states demanded cuts removing her nightclub sequences, which were deemed too glamorous and therefore likely to inspire other women toward similar selfish pursuits. Religious organizations condemned the film as an attack on motherhood itself. Several dioceses organized boycotts specifically targeting this picture. They organized letter-writing campaigns and public protests. The film's financial performance suffered tremendously compared to other Warner releases, directly attributable to organized pressure from moral authorities determined to suppress alternative visions of female choice. Yet critics and viewers who encountered it recognized 3 on a Match as a sophisticated examination of female agency and choice within social constraint. The picture remains one of the most revealing documents of pre-code anxiety about women's autonomy and freedom. Number 6. Ink Safe in Hell, 1931. Irwin Peachel directed this 1931 melodrama, depicting a woman driven into survival strategies through abandonment and circumstance beyond her control, rather than presenting her situation as moral corruption requiring punishment. Safe in Hell suggests structural factors and male cruelty as the architects of her downfall. She isn't inherently depraved or morally bankrupt. She's trapped by economics and masculine abandonment. Dorothea Week's performance showed vulnerability and agency simultaneously, allowing audiences to recognize her as human rather than fallen woman deserving judgment and condemnation. The film's depiction of Caribbean colonial corruption and casual exploitation of vulnerable women struck contemporary viewers as almost documentary in its unflinching observation. Every moment suggested that her circumstances reflected society's failures rather than her own moral deficiency or personal corruption. The camera observes rather than condemns. Censorship boards went ballistic immediately. Several states attempted total prohibition of exhibition. The fact that the film appeared to sympathize with a woman engaged in survival through morally compromised means suggested dangerous ideas about social responsibility for vulnerable populations. Religious organizations declared it an attack on sexual morality itself. The film's refusal to blame the victim seemed like endorsement of her behavior rather than recognition of her circumstances. Safe in Hell was quietly forgotten after the production code's implementation, though modern archivists have recognized it as one of the most honest depictions of gendered economic desperation in early American cinema. Its disappearance from distribution and cultural memory directly resulted from organized suppression campaigns that deemed it too dangerous for public consumption. The film's recovery allows modern viewers to recognize its remarkable sympathy and political sophistication. Number 5. Babyface, 1933. Already celebrated in previous lists, Babyface deserves repeated emphasis as perhaps the single most controversial pre-code film regarding female agency and economic power. Barbara Stanwyck's Lily Powers seduces her way through a Manhattan skyscraper hierarchy with breathtaking precision and calculation. Each conquest occurs literally one floor higher than the previous. Yes, until she reaches the penthouse, representing ultimate triumph and escape from degradation. What truly horrified the establishment was the film's refusal to frame this as tragedy or cautionary tale, demonstrating the inevitable consequences of female immorality. Lily wins. She escapes her degrading situation. She manipulates powerful men through their own desires and emerges victorious without suffering conventional punishment or redemption arc. Her ascent is presented with respect and visual poetry rather than moral condemnation. The film celebrates her intelligence and strategic brilliance. The production code's implementation came partly in direct response to Babyface's perceived attack on sexual morality and female restraint. Censors demanded massive revisions before subsequent releases. The film was banned outright in multiple states. Theater owners faced intense pressure to withdraw it from exhibition. Despite these efforts, audiences who saw the original cut recognized something genuinely revolutionary in the film's aesthetic and moral approach to female power. Discovery of the complete uncut negative in 2004 allowed modern critics to recognize Babyface as proto-feminist cinema, 70 years ahead of contemporary discourse. Yet this radical vision remained suppressed and altered for 70 years, proof of how thoroughly the production code managed to erase alternative visions of female power from mainstream cinema. Number 4. The Story of Temple Drake, 1933. William Faulkner's transgressive novel Sanctuary presented Hollywood with an absolute nightmare scenario during the pivotal moment of moral code implementation. Paramount's 1933 adaptation depicts a young woman kidnapped by criminals and forced into degrading circumstances through male violence and cruelty, rather than present her as inherently corrupted by her circumstances. The film suggests her circumstances reflect systemic exploitation and casual masculine violence that society permits. Miriam Hopkins delivers a devastating performance showing trauma and survival rather than moral dissolution. The film refuses to suggest her circumstances result from her own shortcomings or require self-annihilation for redemption. She's presented as victim of circumstance and male predation, not moral failing or personal corruption. The film's compassionate portrayal seemed revolutionary. The establishment absolutely revolted against the picture. Southern states threatened complete prohibition. The theaters were picketed by morality organizations. Paramount offered women-only matinees as a strange compromise, a tactic that backfired spectacularly when rumors circulated that female viewers were fainting during screenings, supposedly validating claims that the material was genuinely dangerous. The irony that women's emotional response to depictions of violence against women was treated as evidence the film should be banned, rather than that violence against women was wrong, remains darkly revealing about the era's moral frameworks. The patriarchal logic protected male perpetrators rather than female victims. The story of Temple Drake was effectively suppressed for decades, with many filmgoers never encountering it. Modern archival restoration allows contemporary audiences to recognize it as one of the most unflinching examinations of gendered violence and institutional victim blaming in cinema history. Number 3. Red Dust, 1932. Victor Fleming's 1932 adventure picture shattered conventions by depicting a woman capable of casual romantic and economic autonomy without moral judgment or punishment. Jean Harlow's character engages in relationships based on desire rather than matrimonial intention, traveling to Southeast Asia and operating independently within male-dominated colonial spaces. She's charismatic, adventurous, and completely unconcerned with propriety or social approval. What scandalized audiences and moral authorities was the film's fundamental suggestion that female desire and mobility were legitimate expressions of human nature. Harlow's character laughs, flirts, seduces, and abandons relationships on her own timeline without requiring male permission or suffering consequences for her autonomy. She's presented as fully human, rather than moral lesson or cautionary tale. The film celebrates her freedom. Censorship boards across the country demanded revisions, suggesting that her behavior would inevitably result in degradation and punishment. When Fleming refused major alterations, the film faced exhibition restrictions in multiple territories. Insurance companies increased rates. Religious organizations ran targeted campaigns warning families away from what they called a celebration of immoral feminine behavior. The organized pressure threatened financial viability. Red Dust became a template for everything the production code would criminalize regarding female agency and autonomy. Harlow's subsequent performances would be increasingly constrained by new moral restrictions. Her tragic early death led to her filmography being selectively suppressed and edited to conform to post-code morality standards. Modern restoration and exhibition of Red Dust reveals it as a genuinely progressive portrait of female independence. Number 2. The Silver Cord, 1933. John Cromwell's 1933 drama depicted a mother-son relationship with uncomfortable psychological depth, suggesting maternal possessiveness as psychologically damaging rather than touching expression of devotion. Laura LaPlante's portrayal of manipulative motherhood struck viewers as genuinely disturbing because the film refused to frame maternal authority as inherently virtuous and beyond criticism. The film suggests mothers can be toxic and pathological. The narrative examines how possessive parenting damages adult relationships and stunts emotional development. This suggestion that motherhood itself could be pathological flew in the face of idealized feminine virtue that underpinned American social mythology. If mothers could be harmful, what happened to the sacred authority of motherhood? What happened to women's moral superiority as the foundation of civilized society? Nay, censorship boards across the country condemned it as an attack on family structure and maternal authority. Religious organizations ran campaigns warning against its perverse psychological theories. Southern states attempted prohibition. The film was quietly shelved by studios nervous about offending religious constituencies that increasingly wielded economic power over exhibition and distribution. The suppression was systematic and thorough. The Silver Cord represents one of the most thorough suppressions of any major Hollywood production, effectively removed from distribution and cultural memory for decades. Its recovery by film archivists in the late 20th century allowed critics to recognize it as one of the earliest American cinema examinations of family pathology and maternal psychology. Number 1. Imitation of Life, 1934. John Stahl's 1934 melodrama depicted interracial dynamics and color consciousness within African American communities with a frankness that absolutely terrified the white establishment. The film suggests that racism doesn't merely originate from white prejudice, but exists within communities as internalized oppression that damages family relationships and psychological well-being. The film examines how marginalized people internalize the oppression directed at them. Claudette Colbert's white female character forms a genuine partnership with her African-American maid, suggesting economic collaboration and friendship across racial lines. Yet the film's most devastating sequences involve the maid's daughter attempting to pass as white to escape racism, ultimately rejecting her mother and heritage in pursuit of white acceptance. The film doesn't judge her choice harshly, instead depicting the psychological toll that systemic racism inflicts on vulnerable individuals. The tragedy emerges from the system. This moral complexity regarding race relations seemed absolutely unthinkable to the white power structure maintaining segregation and racial hierarchy. The film was heavily edited in Southern territories to remove sequences suggesting any possibility of genuine human connection across racial lines. Certain screenings were restricted or prohibited entirely in regions where depicting African American dignity seemed threatening to established racial hierarchies. The suppression was regional and systematic. Imitation of Life remains one of the most extraordinary pre-code films addressing race, with a complexity that cinema wouldn't approach again for decades. Its recovery and restoration by contemporary archivists allows modern audiences to recognize how thoroughly cinema was deployed as tool of racial oppression, with films suggesting human connection across racial lines, systematically suppressed to maintain white supremacist power structures. The film's radical approach to race relations explains why it remains suppressed. So there you have it. 13 films so dangerous they were either banned, heavily censored, or effectively erased from cultural memory by an establishment terrified of what uncontrolled cinema might suggest to audiences about power, gender, class, and race. The production code wasn't implemented to preserve morality. It was implemented to preserve power. Did you know about any of these films before? Which banned pre-code picture do you think represented the most genuine threat to the establishment? Sound off in the comments and tell us which one shocked you the most. After all, the stories cinema suppresses reveal far more about power than the stories it celebrates.